If you were a jet-setting business person in the mid-aughts, IBM's X series of ThinkPads weren't just an essential business tool, they were a status symbol. Having an X series marked you as a true road warrior, a key emissary for your company, equipped for whatever the corporate world could throw at you. I was not a jet-setting business person in the mid-aughts. I was a student using a gateway laptop that I was thrilled to have come up with $750 to buy. But I was a nerd, I read PC World, and I longed for something better. 14 years later, I finally have my hands on it. The IBM ThinkPad X60 is an ultra-portable laptop from a bygone era, and I love it. The X60 obviously has some weaknesses for actual use in 2020, but reality can wait. Let's start by talking about what there is to love on the X60. To start off with, I love the aesthetics from the ThinkPads of this era in general. While there are ergonomic touches all over the place, these laptops are unapologetically machine-like in terms of design. Modern tech usually seeks out some sort of conventional beauty in their design, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's hard for me not to love the aggressively utilitarian design of the X60. The in-your-face hinges, the chunky modular plastic, the quick removal panels for upgrades, and the bevy of status lights all scream of a device that was first built for work. The aesthetic isn't all a chunk fest though, as the X60 makes excellent use of its width. The screen features narrow bezels that look downright modern. Due to adding a webcam on the very next model, it would be years before any other ThinkPad would return to bezels as narrow as those on the X60. The keyboard joined suit, stretching nearly the entire width of the device. These two design elements really help the X60 feel like it was built to be a true traveling champion of its era. The commitment to getting things done follows through to the port lineup, which is truly impressive for such a small device. The SD card reader and FireWire port gives creative types lots of options, while the inclusion of a 56K modem, in addition to Ethernet, gives the X60 a fun mix of connectivity options. While I don't find myself needing a bunch of ports on laptops all that often, especially not a 56K modem, I do love the come-at-me bro nature of having them all. The X60 is more than just the Mighty Mouse of the 2006 laptop world. It also features all the great qualities of the ThinkPad line. Magnesium-reinforced frames for better rigidity, an unparalleled laptop keyboard, keyboard drainage holes to prevent liquid damage, and of course, the Ingenious ThinkLight for working after dark. ThinkPads have a special quality, and the X60 is a perfect example. With all the nostalgic design poetry out of the way, it's time to talk about using a ThinkPad X60 in 2020. Is it still useful for day-to-day computing? Does it have any other uses? Should you consider buying one? We'll start with the big one. Is the X60 still useful for day-to-day computing? The short answer is that compared to no computer at all, it is definitely still useful, but there are some issues. One issue is that Windows 10 stopped working on the X60, or stopped supporting the X60 in late 2018. This means that the X60 can technically run the 32-bit version of Windows 10, but that it will stop receiving security updates much sooner than newer Windows 10 devices, which is not good. This means that if you want to actually use an X60 for normal everyday stuff, you'll need to run Linux. Not a problem, right? There are more high-quality Linux distros than ever, right? Well, another issue is that since the X60 only has a 32-bit CPU, that means you can only run 32-bit operating systems. Since Ubuntu Linux dropped 32-bit support in 2018, many Ubuntu-based distros, which is a lot of them, also dropped support for 32-bit computers. Many of the other most popular non-Ubuntu distros also dropped support for 32-bit around the same time. There definitely are, and will continue to be, 32-bit Linux distros out there, but they tend to be a bit more bare bone, lacking the spit and polish of the big distros. Since I've already said more than I'm really qualified to about Linux, let's move on to the performance of the X60 in 2020. My X60 has the top-end Core Duo T2400, with 3GB of RAM installed and a 7200 RPM hard drive. Obviously, that hard drive is going to hold things back a little bit in terms of startup times compared to an SSD, but it's not nearly as bad as I'd expected. Web browsing is pretty sluggish. Don't get me wrong, it's totally usable, but there's a noticeable delay loading even pretty simple web pages. Every time. It's like every time you click on a link, there's a delay. Every time you click on another link, there's a delay. It's just continuous. Streaming video is doable, but it's not a great experience. YouTube hasn't wanted to work for me at anything higher than 480p, which is honestly actually probably for the best, as even 480p playback experiences dropped frames, resulting in video that isn't as smooth as it should be. The other biggest problem I have on the web with the X60 is the screen resolution. 1024 by 768 honestly isn't that awful of a resolution on a 12.1 inch 4:3 aspect ratio screen, but in 2020, in a world dominated by higher resolution displays, it is non-optimal to say the least. In order to make browsing the web feel anything other than totally claustrophobic, I've had to use Firefox's zoom out tool. Chrome has the same type of tool to actually zoom out of the websites that I'm going to, which, given the low resolution of the screen, can make smaller text, not quite as sharp as you'd be expect it to be. For document creation and light web browsing, I'd say the X60 holds up well and is decently usable. Unfortunately, for even heavy web browsing, like opening a bunch of tabs, watching YouTube, or spending hours online, the X60's continued performance hiccups, those little slowdowns I mentioned every time you load a page, are likely to become annoying pretty quickly. So the X60 has some utility for light day-to-day usage, but is there anything else you can do with one? Well, if you enjoy retro tech, the X60 would make a great Windows XP device for interacting with older software and hardware. I have several old Palm OS devices which never got software releases to make them compatible with Windows 7, and keeping an old laptop at the ready is my preferred option to keep them up and running. Sure, I could run a Windows XP virtual machine with USB pass-through, but connecting one piece of old hardware to another can only add to the magic. Also, for all of the X60's lackluster performance by 2020 standards, it's quite snappy in Windows XP, and a heck of a lot smaller than keeping a retro desktop around. Beyond that, there's not really a ton to do with a retro laptop if you find its performance too limiting for daily usage. You could always use it as a home server of some sort, but unless you already have an X60 just laying around, or can get one very cheap, there are better options than a laptop for server usage. Given the quality of the keyboard and relatively small size, it could also be interesting as a distraction-free writing machine if you're into that sort of thing, but I don't really know. I'm kind of grasping at straws here. Alright, so let's just get down to it and talk about whether or not you should actually consider purchasing a ThinkPad X60. The really short answer is almost certainly not. Like we talked about, the day-to-day performance, it leaves a lot to be desired. And that's sort of where I draw the line in terms of just providing general recommendations on technologies, that it should be able to get the day-to-day stuff done. But I do think there are a few possible scenarios where it would make sense to actually pick one of these guys up. So scenario number one of three, they're going to be three, so we're going to get there. But scenario number one is probably the best reason to actually buy one, is if basically you got to this video because you saw an ad on Craigslist for like a ThinkPad X60 selling for like $40 or something, and you really need a laptop right now. The one caveat to this is that you do have to be comfortable throwing Linux on there and using Linux. As long as you're fine with that, if you found a great deal on one of these and you're on a really tight budget and you just need a laptop to like get you through to do some stuff, then absolutely you can do a whole lot worse than a ThinkPad X60 even in 2020, as long as you're totally fine running Linux on it. That's like the one caveat there. So reason two is if, like me, you're a person that has old computer type hardware, or old like PDAs, old digital cameras, just old electronics, old stuff that interfaces with computers, and you need to run an older version of Windows, like Windows XP maybe, and you want to have something around to do that. Like I mentioned, you can do that through virtual machines these days, but it's always nice to have a dedicated PC just for handling that old type of stuff, not having to deal with USB pass-through and having a bunch of stuff cluttering around your main desk. Just have it all put away in an area where you can get your toys out and play with them from time to time. That's a totally valid reason to pick one of these up. Like I said, it's a great Windows XP laptop, and it's really compact, which is, you can't ask for a whole lot more when you're collecting old electronics, or at least for me. if you want to avoid having like all your loved ones come do the hoarder style intervention. You know, smaller is better when it comes to collecting old stuff, at least for me. So the third reason that you might want to consider picking up a ThinkPad X60 in 2020 is if you're just a total ThinkPad dork. So I'm also kind of a ThinkPad dork. I don't have it nearly as bad as a lot of people, but I've bought several used ThinkPads over the last few years and generally rotate them around, end up giving them off to family members, that kind of thing. But I just think they're great devices. I love the way they're designed. They have a very timeless element to them. And the X60 is actually a pretty unique ThinkPad in that it's one of the very last ThinkPads to actually bear the IBM badge. So the X60 was released in 2006, and that was right around the time that IBM was selling the ThinkPad division to Lenovo. So you'll see we've got the ThinkPad badge on the inside and on the outside. I guess we'll go ahead and flip it both sides. The X60 also is one of the last ones. I think the X61, so the immediate refresh following this, was the very last one to have no trackpad. That's just another classic ThinkPad design decision. So if you're a fan of ThinkPads, the X60 definitely has, you know, enough in its historical tool belt to, I think, make it a justifiable purchase, especially if you get a pretty good deal on it. So yeah, there are a few reasons to buy it, but I think probably not. Most people probably shouldn't buy one of these, but there are some legitimate, valid reasons that you might want to do it. Anyway, I hope this video was helpful or entertaining or some combination of the two. Either way, I do want to thank you for watching and hope that you have a great rest of your day.